Greetings and welcome. I am Justavor, bringing you what I hope is constructive information on what the system of racism is and how it works, as well as what can be done to replace it with the system of justice. Why Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had to be assassinated, according to Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. In this video, we will explore the psychology behind the perceived necessity to assassinate the ancestor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in regard to those who classify themselves as white. The foundation of this psychological observation is based upon the theory of the grandsestor, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, and her theory of color confrontation and racism, white supremacy. Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, author of the ISIS Papers, The Keys to the Colors, was a third-generation physician as well as a general and child psychiatrist who was credited with being the first medical professional to study the psychology of those who classify themselves as white as a group, as well as those who are classified as non-white in the global system of white supremacy.
It was written for a group of black psychiatrists who were looking at racism.
Yeah.
It was also written because as a psychiatrist and working in a hospital trying to treat black people and white people, but recognizing that the majority of the problems that black patients had in a psychiatric hospital, when you took a history, you would run smack into racism. So I knew I had to understand racism to help solve the mental health problems of black people.
Dr. Welsing's theory of color confrontation can be summed up in her definition of racism, white supremacy.
It is a local, national, global system, behavioral system of thought, speech, action, and emotional response, consciously and or subconsciously determined, practiced by people who classify themselves as white in all areas of people activity, economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war, for the ultimate purpose of maintaining white genetic survival and preventing white genetic annihilation on planet Earth, a planet upon which the overwhelming majority of people are classified as non-white by the minority of people who classify themselves as white. And the people who are classified as non-white are genetically dominant in terms of skin coloration compared to the genetic recessive white-skinned people.
In short, the basis of Dr. Welsing's theory is that those who classify themselves as white, possessing mostly recessive genetics, are the global minority on the planet and have found it necessary to establish, maintain, expand, and refine a system of control, subjugation, and domination of the genetic dominant people they have classified as non-white, who are the global majority, in an effort to avoid genetic annihilation. The definition we use on this channel for the terms racism and white supremacy can be considered a condensed version of Dr. Welsing's definition. The definition we use is as follows: a global system of people who classify themselves as white and who are dedicated to the mistreatment and subjugation of all those they have classified as not white. But what does this have to do with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., famously referred to as MLK?
This is Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday holiday. And people will say, well, here's a man who talked about love. Yeah. Why was he killed? And I say that the deeper logic is, what if all black and white people and non-white people and white people love? What would happen to white people? White would disappear.
There it is. According to Dr. Welsing's theory, MLK's assassination was deemed absolutely necessary by those who practice racism because his doctrine of love would have ultimately led to the genetic annihilation of white people. There are some who will say that Dr. King's assassination was no major conspiracy because he was assassinated by a white supremacist, James Earl Ray, who was acting alone. I would respond to this notion with a reminder that the United States government was found guilty on December 8, 1999 of conspiring to assassinate Dr. King Jr. It was determined that local, state, and federal U.S. government agencies, as well as the mafia, were all involved in the conspiracy. the jury awarded Dr. King's family a whopping $100. Some people would ask, if love or reproduction between whites and non-whites is so bad, then why is it promoted and supported by so many white people? This is a good question. I would respond by reminding non-white people that a major tenet of overt white supremacists is to keep the white race pure. The primary racist tactic of racial white sacrifice reminds us that white people do not always agree over what they consider the best and most effective way to maintain the system of white supremacy, racism. They will harm or even kill each other over how racism should be practiced. A common pattern that we see in those who practice racism, white supremacy, is that members of the white team usually support thoughts, speech, and actions that would help to maintain, expand, and refine the system. Thus, the practice of sex between whites and their non-white victims can be viewed as a benefit for the white supremacists. Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. reminds us in the United Independent Compensatory Code System concept of the tactics of racial sexual confusion, as well as racial classification confusion. These tactics are just a few that racists will use to maintain the system of white supremacy. I encourage viewers to view the video entitled Primary Tactics Suspected Racists Use According to the Code. I have included a link to that video below. Even though whites appear to support sexual reproduction between whites and their victims, these acts are not as widespread, especially on a global level, as they are promoted to make us think they are. The benefit is that this maximum racist aggression causes major confusion, while at the same time, it is not seen as such, thus benefiting those white people working to maintain and refine the system of white supremacy. Another benefit the assassination of Dr. King presented for those who practice white supremacy can be seen in the impact his assassination had on black people.
This child came and I said, sweetheart, don't you want to work hard in school? This was years ago. So you can help black people. And this little boy said, no. He wasn't being smart alecky, he wasn't being rude. And I said, you know, the psychiatrist wants to hear the child say yes. He said, no. And I said, why not? He said, if you try to help black people, you're going to be killed.
As well as how white people use Dr. King and quotes attributed to him to combat black people who are attempting to understand and counter racism.
Okay, and what's your name?
My name is Bob.
Bob.
Yes.
Sounds appropriate. Bob what?
Bob Smith.
Bob Smith.
Yes.
Okay, so I see you got a photo of Martin Luther King over there.
That's
like,
right.
Why? But no
Why?
black people on the site.
Why? Because let's start off by saying.
Because
MLK's method of attempting to replace the system of white supremacy with justice through nonviolent resistance, as well as love and harmony between all people on the planet, was and still is criticized by many of his contemporaries and by some today. But does Dr. Francis Cress Welsing's theory regarding his assassination illustrate the danger Dr. King presented to the system of white supremacy? I do not agree with everything Dr. King said or did in his efforts to produce justice, as there is no person on the planet whom I totally agree with on everything. I will acknowledge that Dr. King, like many other victims of white supremacy, did the best he could with what he had. There are many valuable lessons to be learned from what many people think he did correctly, and what he did that many people would deem as incorrect. For this, I think he deserves to be remembered and honored. The legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has become a complicated one, as suspected racists often only mention Dr. King so as to weaponize him against non-white people. Even the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday is used as a tactic of racial showcasing confusion, despite the efforts of the ancestor Coretta Scott King to have her husband's memory and legacy honored. To those suspects, I say,
if whites loved Dr. King, they should have kept Dr. King.
But you didn't keep him. You killed him. And in doing so, you taught us that whether we promote justice through nonviolent resistance like Dr. King, or through counter-violence like the grandcestor Malcolm X, the result for victims of white supremacy who attempt to end the system of white supremacy will be the same. What we are learning, still learning, but learning nonetheless, is not to allow you to use the tactic of racial shadowboxing to pit non-white people against each other by using opposing theories, words, and or actions by our progenitors, progeny, and other victims of racism. We are learning to learn from the mistakes of the past and use these lessons to replace the system of white supremacy with a system of justice. Justice meaning balance between people, guaranteeing that no person is mistreated, and guaranteeing that the person who needs help the most gets the most constructive help. What are your thoughts on Dr. Francis Cress Welsing's theory as it relates to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Feel free to leave your questions, comments, and concerns. For more information about the purpose and goals of this channel, as well as some basic definitions of words and terms we use in reference to our work, I have included a link below containing this information. If you would like an even better understanding of the code and how it works, please visit producejustice.com to order the United Independent Compensatory Code System concept by Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. There are many constructive suggestions for ending the system of white supremacy, and Mr. Fuller's code book and its word guide act as guides to getting and keeping on code. I would also suggest reading the ISIS papers, The Keys to the Colors, by Dr. Francis Cress Welsing. I think that the ISIS papers works best as a complement to the code book. If you feel this content is constructive and worth your time and energy, please subscribe and share to support the making of more content in the future. Much appreciation for all the Vors already subscribed. I am Justavor, and I'm still learning. Thank you for watching. Until next time.
Let me say something that gets to the very crux of the matter, and this may be offensive for some to hear who are not on the side that we're on. White people, we have been the problem for 400 years.
Say that again.
Let me say it one more time for those of you who didn't hear me. White people, we have been the problem for 400 years.